For this lesson on skewers, we're going to be playing in beautiful Yosemite National Park. All right, let's check out skewers. Remember we talked about pins? We talked about the less valuable piece kind of being a shield for a more valuable piece, and a piece is stuck. Many people call skewers a reverse pin, because in a skewer it's the other way around. Here the bishop is going to skewer the king and the knight. The king is the more valuable piece and it's out in front. And the less valuable piece is the knight and it's in the back. When this king moves, the knight will fall. We call this a skewer.
I like skewers, teacher. Now I can finally beat you. Here goes.
A moment of clarity in the eye of the storm.
Oh, no. Nice try, my young student, but that is not a skewer. That's not a legal move. Let me teach the lesson, all right? Thank you. Let's break down a skewer into all the parts. First, we have an attack in a straight line. It's a straight line attack on two pieces. And we also have an attacker. The single attacker is a long distance operator that can generate this kind of attack. The only pieces that can create a skewer are rooks, bishops, and queens. And by the way, those are also the only pieces that can create a pin. We also have the front piece. Usually the more valuable piece is going to be in front. And the piece in the back is the less valuable piece. And what happens is, when the more valuable piece steps out of the way, the piece in the back falls. In this case, this bishop on b2 is going to win that knight on g7. Let's look at a skewer in a real position. Here, the white bishop on g5 is going to skewer the queen and the rook. This is powerful. The queen is compelled to step out of the way, and the rook is going to fall. Bishop will take the rook. Here you see the king and the queen are lined up on the same file. Always something a little risky in that kind of configuration. So the white rook comes in, calls check from d2. Look at that. This is an absolute skewer, and it's the best skewer of all. The king will step out of the way. Bye-bye, queen. In this position, we also have a skewer. The white rook goes to a1 and skewers the black queen on a5. Wait a second, you might say. I don't see anything. The queen can just move. Well, this is a case where we have a situational skewer. The square on a8, see that square on a8? The rook is also attacking and threatening that square. So the black queen is skewered. That is the front piece. It's more valuable, but the piece behind the queen is actually a square instead of a piece, but that square is worth one rook. What happens is the queen moves out of the way, the rook drops to a8, creates another skewer on the king moves out of the way, and finally the rook on h8 falls. So in this position, that rook on a1 is actually skewering the queen to a square. Can you see that? Pretty awesome, huh? Now I'd like to share with you a scene from Searching for Bobby Fischer, a great movie about a child chess prodigy. If you haven't seen it and you want to, you might want to jump ahead a couple minutes. Otherwise, let's just enjoy this clip and we can watch a skewer in action.
He's got it.
He's got it. How do you know he's got it?
He's got it.
What? Come on, move. What's that supposed to mean?
I'm offering you a draw.
Draw? You've got to be kidding.
You've lost. You just don't know it.
I've lost. Look at the board.
I have. Take the draw, and I'll share the championship.
Move.
Check. Good game.
And you know what pins are. Let's see if we can spot the difference. Look at this bishop here. This bishop is attacking the queen and the rook. Is it a pin or a skewer? Well, this is a skewer because we have the most valuable piece in front. The queen is a high value. The rook is low value. That's a skewer. And let's look at this next one. Here we have a bishop on b4. Coming down on these two pieces, the knight and the bishop. Is it a pin? Is it a skewer? Well, this is actually a pin. It's a pin because the knight is stuck. If the knight moves, the bishop drops. Yes, they're the same value piece, but consider this. If the bishop takes the knight, then the pawn takes the bishop. It's an even trade. There's nothing gained. But if the knight moves, then black will gain 3 full points by taking the free bishop on d2. So this is a pin. Now, I should also mention, if there was a white rook on d1, this would be nothing. See, we have this bishop kind of eyeing both of these rooks. Would you call this a pin or a skewer? Well, let's consider. The piece in the back is not more valuable than the piece in the front, and that's a requirement for a pin. For there to be a pin, whatever's in the back must be of greater value than what's in front. Also consider that in pins, the front piece is technically usually immobilized, or it's limited in its movement. Here, there's no limited movement. There's no piece that's limited over the other one. This is more appropriately called a skewer. And this is a case where sometimes skewers do not have to have the more valuable piece in front. They can both be equal value. However, in the case of a pin, the greatest value is always in the back. What do you think this is? Skewer, pin? No, this is neither. Remember, the only pieces that can create a skewer are bishops, rooks, and queens. This is actually a fork, and we will talk about these in a later lesson. So let's look at a position where we can see a skewer in action. Here, the white rook on a1 would love to skewer that queen and rook. So he decides to move here to e1. Is this a skewer? Look carefully. Not exactly. The queen just simply comes down, takes the white rook, and calls checkmate. Oh, that was not what we wanted. Let's try that again. Let's imagine that bishop on g2 is actually on f2. Now it's a skewer. The queen is skewered to the rook. If the queen were to come down and take the rook, now the bishop could take the queen. So the queen moves out of the way, and the rook takes the black rook with check. Let's go over all the ways to get out of a skewer. One way is to choose the least loss. I'll go over that in a second. Another way is to insert a pin, or we can counterattack. Let's look at all of these. First, the least loss. What does that mean? Well, when we're in a skewer, we basically have these three options. We can try to capture the attacker. We can move the piece out in front of the skewer, or we can just stay there and do something else. So let's go back to the same position we just saw. Here, the white rook is definitely skewering the black queen and the rook. The black queen wants to move out of the way, and when she does, the white rook will take the black rook with check. This is a powerful attack, and this is another reason why skewers are often decisive. If you find yourself in a skewer, it's often much worse than a pin. These types of things will win you games. So if you find yourself in one, it's bad news, but let's remember how to respond. First, we know that our queen can either take the rook or move out of the way. Which one would be better? Let's calculate. If we move our queen out of the way, then black will lose a rook. That is a loss of 5, -5, and white doesn't lose a thing. So we have a total loss of 5. But now let's consider if we take the rook. Then white loses a rook, we lose a queen, and compute this. So white loses a rook, we gain 5 from taking the rook. We lose the queen, so we lose 9. It's a total loss of -4, -4 compared to -5. So in this position, after calculating, it's better that black takes the rook. Sometimes you want to think about this. Don't just move the queen, because the loss could be even more than if you just sacrifice the queen. So right here, yeah, it's bad either way for black, but it's a little bit less bad by taking the rook. Now let's consider sitting there and doing something else, like we often do when we're in class, right? Okay. Let's look at these pawns here. See this white and black pawn? Let's just take this position and change it just a little bit. Let's give black one extra pawn on h3. Now, let's consider this position. It's black to move. Black is in a skewer. Now, when you find yourself in a skewer, the first thing you want to do, you actually should look for something else. What can I do? I'm in a bad position. Yeah, you're in a bad position. In this case, black has something else he can do. He can push this pawn to h2 and ignore the whole skewer. Go ahead, take the queen. I'm not happy about it. I'm not happy you're taking my queen, but this gives me one move, right? I have one move to try to do something, try to create counterplay. So by pushing this pawn to h2, amazingly enough, in this position, black rescues his game. Now let's look at another way to handle a skewer. We can insert a pin. Look at this. This bishop comes here to h4 and skewers the king and queen, calling check. Ugh, it's just a nightmare if you're black. However, black has a pretty good resource here. He can insert a piece in between the king and the bishop and create a pin. Look at this. By bringing his knight there to f6, he deliberately pins his knight to the king in order to get his queen out of the skewer. Do you see that? Very smart tactic. I mean, how often in a game do you want to give yourself a pin? We don't like creating pins on ourselves, but in a case like this, especially in a skewer, hey, creating a pin on yourself is much better than letting your queen drop. So in this move here, black actually saves his queen. Let's look at this example. Here, the black rook creates a skewer. Boom. King, queen, skewered. White queen is not happy. But then white says, aha, hey, I remember my chess lessons. I can create a pin, and puts the knight out in front, pinning the knight to the king. Well, pins work sometimes, and sometimes they don't. In this case, it doesn't work very well. It's actually the worst move white could have done. Watch this. Black takes the pinned piece, calls check, king captures back, and there you go, another skewer. Oh, the poor queen never had a chance. And now we're going to give you a challenge. We're going to look at the counterattack. This is the last way to get out of a skewer. And this is a beautiful chess position. I think you're going to like this. But before we show you the answer, I really want you to take some time and try to figure this one out. Black bishop skewers the queen and the rook. This is horrible. Now, this position is pretty even as it is. But when black does this, white can feel the tension, feel the stress. Look deep in this position. White has an amazing counter move, a counterattack that white can play against black. Can you find it? Take some time and give it a try. Here in this position, white moves the rook to b1 and pins the bishop, pinning the bishop to the b8 square, saying, go ahead, I dare you to take my queen. Black has been dared to take the queen. What happens if the black bishop takes the white queen? Do you see what white does? That's right. That is checkmate. There is no place to go for the king. So by pinning that bishop on b5 with the rook on b1, the black bishop cannot take the queen or else it's checkmate. What a brilliant way to get out of a skewer. But your opponent is not simply going to lie down and give you a free skewer. I mean, how many chess opponents will say, hey, go ahead, skewer my queen and rook, or skewer my king and my queen? No, it doesn't work that way. So how do you get skewers in a chess game? The most common way to do it, if you're going to look for a skewer, is to create one. You have to create one on your opponent. How do you do that? Well, oftentimes in chess, when we want to get a favorable position, we have to create it using different types of tactics on our opponent. We put all the tactics together in a package, and we can create positions that are favorable to us. This is what makes great chess players. It's more like the work of a sculptor or a painter. You're creating something on the chessboard. Look at this position here. This is a challenging position. It's white to move. You can imagine if the white queen on g2, for example, were to go to a8 and call check on the king, king just moves to f7 and they can trade queens. But white does have one amazing move in this position to wreak some havoc in black's camp. Can you find it? If you were to find this move, congratulations. White rook to h8, pinning the queen against the king. Is it a pin? Well, technically it is. The queen cannot move away from the king. She's kind of stuck. However, she can simply take the rook, right? Black queen can take the rook. It's unguarded. And that's the best move for black. So here, the black queen takes the rook. And now the tactics work. Do you see what you can do if you're white? That's right. Queen to a8, check, and skewer. By giving up the rook, we gain the queen. Amazing move. And this is the beauty of chess. And that's it. Now you know what a skewer is. You're now a pro with skewers and pins. You're getting better already. Good luck in your chess, and we'll talk to you next time.